Thank you for coming out this morning, and also to Barry and the hosts for the opportunity to be here to tell you about some of the work that we do in my lab. And I'm going to talk to you about personality in animals. And I actually study personality in animals for a living, and some of you might wonder, can you really make a living out of doing this? Isn't this just something we tell funny stories about our pets? And I bet I could probably ask many of you, if you have a cat or a dog, would you say that your cat or dog has a personality? Yes, yes. Okay, so what are the kinds of words that some of you might use to describe your pet's personality? What's that? Yeah. Sassy. I like it. Okay. Yes. Stubborn. Yeah. What else? Mean. Yeah. Evil. Whoa. Yeah, so, you know, probably most of us, if we actually spend very much time hanging out with animals, as lots of us do, since we have pets, it's not too hard to convince you that non-human animals, like humans, often have kind of a distinctive way of behaving that's different from other individuals, and that it's something that seems to be part of who they are, that they take with them over time, and you put them in different situations, and there's an element of predictability in how animals behave. Individual animals behave. And so you can actually go online and do things like take a personality test for your cat. It can be things like, when you play with your cat, what does she do? Does she play with you for a long time? Does she run away from the toy's movement, plays sometimes and only for a short time, likes to play for a while, but then runs around the house, ignores the toy, and continues to sleep on the couch or on your lap? So there are some quantitative kinds of tests that you can do to kind of evaluate your cat's personality. This is just an online version. Here's actually an example from a PhD thesis that was devoted to trying to develop a questionnaire for describing personality in dogs. And some of the questions here are, you know, rate from 1 to 7, strongly disagree to strongly agree. Is your dog relaxed when greeting people? Does your dog behave aggressively toward other dogs? Is your dog anxious? Those sorts of things. So the idea here is that if you take enough data and ask, say, pet owners enough questions about the behavior of their particular animal, that you might be able to come up with some systems that can generally describe the behavior of your particular subject, of your particular pet. Now, this is obviously something that we as humans, if we enjoy hanging out with animals, which is pretty much what led me into this business in the first place, where it was not too hard to convince people that animals have personality. But is this really something that's worthy to study from a scientific point of view? Or are these just funny little cute anecdotes that we can tell about our animals? And I'm going to try to convince you today that yes, this is a subject that's worthy of scientific endeavor, and it's not just cute fuzzy stories that we tell about our pets. And in part, this is due to increased recognition by scientists who actually, when you observe the behavior of marked individuals, and you keep track of them over time, that people are finding out more and more that even something like a ladybug amidst a swarm of other ladybugs, where all these ladybugs look the same, but if you actually take time to keep track of the behavior of individual ladybugs, that you find that they behave consistently and differently from one another through time and across situations. Same thing of a penguin within a colony of penguins, where everybody looks the same. A penguin's a penguin's a penguin's a penguin. But actually, it turns out that if you take much time to actually track marked individuals, people are finding that there's an element of distinctiveness to individual behavior. And even the same thing of a fish within a school of other fish, where all these fish look the same. But again, if we take time to actually track individuals, we find that animals have a kind of distinctive way of behaving that's different from other individuals. So what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to tell you a little bit of history, a very brief history of the study of personality in animals. I'm then going to get to what I call the sciencey part. This is the part where I try to show you why some of this variation is interesting from a scientific point of view. I'm then going to tell you about a cool critter that we work on in my lab that are called sticklebacks. These are little fish. And I'm going to tell you how we study personality in sticklebacks, both in the wild. And then I'm also going to tell you a little bit about how we're interested in the role of dads in influencing their offspring's personalities. Okay, so I'm going to show you some videos. This is the little history part. In the 1990s, there was a group of researchers in the Netherlands who were studying domesticated pigs, and they were putting pigs through these mazes. So this is a view of a tea maze from overhead. The pig has been trained that there is a food reward in the right arm of the maze, and here's our beautiful pig. Went immediately to the right arm. Great job, pig. Now, there is a novel object, which is this upturned bucket that's been introduced into the maze. And here we had a pig who's, again, the food is on the left arm of the maze, and the pig kind of inspects the bucket and then goes straight to find the food. Good job, pig. But here's what a different individual did. So this is the same situation, but now this individual is again confronted by this bucket that they've never seen before, and this pig has a very different reaction than that first pig did. So, you know, whereas that first pig pretty much just went and ignored the bucket, this pig has a very different response. So you can see that, I mean, these are domesticated pigs, but these different individuals clearly had a very different response to this same thing that was being introduced into this environment for them. So everybody had been trained where to find the food, and notice that both pigs eventually did get to the food, but one of the pigs basically ignored a change in the environment, whereas another one of these pigs seemed to be very attuned to a change in their environment. So now what happened is the researchers changed the location of the food reward. So whereas the food reward used to be located on this arm of the maze, now the food reward is located on this arm of the maze, and this is showing what that second pig did. So that second pig that had that very strong response to the novel object. Yeah, no problem. But look what happens to that first individual, that one that had that really kind of, that ignored the novel object. So again, the food is on this arm of the maze. That's time lapse. Takes a running start. Yeah, that's right. Eventually, the pig goes over to the other side of the maze. So these different animals had very different responses. And you might think, oh, well, that one who basically just ignored changes in the environment, who ignored the bucket, that pig is probably pretty smart, right? It like learned to find the food reward and did the same thing over and over again. But then how that individual responded when the environment changed, when the food was located then at a different arm of the maze, actually that animal had kind of a hard time adjusting to changes in the environment. Whereas that second pig that had kind of the neophobic response, that had a really strong reaction to the novel object and spent a lot of time exploring the maze, that pig, you might imagine, actually would do pretty well in a kind of variable environment because it's more flexible. So researchers in the Netherlands were documenting this kind of variation in how animals respond to changes in the environment. And they started studying this not only in pigs, but also in rabbits and mice and birds, and came up with ideas about how their animals differ in the ways that they cope with changes in the environment. And these different coping styles are associated with all sorts of important stuff, like how aggressive they are, how exploratory they are, how quickly they can learn new tasks, but also how well they might do in a different environment. And they came up with some hypotheses that maybe these different styles, these different coping styles, might be maintained within a single population, because you can imagine in years that are really stable, let's say you live in a really stable environment where things are really constant, that proactive pig that ignores changes and always does the same thing over and over again, that kind of animal might do really well. But in an environment that's more variable, let's say in a seasonal environment or in periods of drought or when there's other types of changes in the environment, those reactive individuals, the ones that respond strongly to changes in the environment but then can adjust their behavior flexibly, those individuals might do better in changing sorts of circumstances. So these were some really interesting ideas that people kind of working somewhat in the periphery in the Netherlands were starting to advocate. And interestingly, around the same time, there were some studies that were being published on this side of the Atlantic, including by David Sloan Wilson and his colleagues, that also were drawing attention to the importance of individual differences or individual variation within natural populations. So this is actually a study from the 90s on these cool fish that are called pumpkin seed sunfish. They look like this right here. And in this study, what they did is they had these pumpkin seed sunfish that were out in a pond, and they used two different ways to collect their fish. They either used what's called a seine, which looks like this. This is basically this big net that you can drag through the pond and pretty much collect everybody. Another way to catch these sunfish is to put out these traps that are called minnow traps. They look like this, and they have sort of a tapering middle, and what happens is that fish will swim into the trap and they'll get stuck and they won't be able to come out again. So what these researchers did is they collected these pumpkin seed sunfish within a pond via these two different methods, via seines and via minnow traps, and they just compared what do animals look like that were caught by these two different methods. And they found something really remarkable. When they looked inside their guts to see what kinds of things these fish had been eating, they found that fish that had been collected by seines versus minnow traps were eating totally different foods. So here's sort of a list of their gut contents. You know, what's in the guts of a trapped fish versus the guts of seined fish. They're eating different foods. They also looked at parasites, both ecto and endoparasites, on these fish that had been caught by traps versus by seines. And they found that these different types of individuals had very different parasite communities. So they were experiencing different kinds of parasites. They also, when they brought these animals into the lab and they kind of monitored them to see how they adjusted to the lab, they found that these trapped and seined fish differed in how long it took them to acclimate to being in a lab. So like basically how long did it take them to start eating once they'd brought them into the lab. So this was suggesting that, you know, these two different types of individuals that seem to be caught by these two different methods, you know, differed in all sorts of respects. They differed in where they were living, what kinds of habitats they were using, what they were eating, what parasites they were afflicted by, and how they responded behaviorally to the lab. And what they suggested was that those traps are kind of shiny and bright. And what they suspected was that it's the bold, exploratory pumpkin seed sunfish that were being attracted to these traps, whereas seines were just sort of collecting everybody. And so they suspected that these differences in trapability kind of reflected differences in neophobia and also in boldness. And these behavioral differences were associated with all sorts of really important things for these animals. It influenced what kinds of foods they were eating, what kinds of parasites they were experiencing. And they also did these snorkeling observations to like keep track of what kinds of habitats that these animals were using. So this study also brought attention to the idea that there's a lot of variation among individuals within the same species within natural populations. And this variation could potentially be really important. It's not just like a single kind of axis of behavioral variation, but it influences really important stuff like what kind of habitat these animals are using, what kinds of parasites they experience, and stuff like that. So that's sort of my 2 minutes of history of the subject. of personality in animals to try to give you a sense of what got people started to be interested in studying personality in animals were some of these really important empirical studies in the 90s. I'm now going to try to convince you from a sciencey, this is the sciencey part, why individual differences, consistent individual differences in behavior are really interesting from a scientific point of view. And the first point is it's difficult to explain why should there be variation. Why do individuals within natural populations, why do they differ from one another? Now, as humans, we're like, of course, everybody's all different. We have kind of great appreciation. We know that variation is all over us. But I'm going to try to explain kind of from a very simple evolutionary point of view why variation is hard to explain. So let's imagine that we have a population that's made up of different types of animals. Let's call it, so this is within a species. Let's say some individuals are bold and some individuals are shy, and they're all sort of mixed up together. Now, let's also make it a very important assumption that there is a heritable component to these behaviors. So bold individuals tend to have bold kids. Shy individuals tend to have shy kids. So there's some inheritance of this behavior. Let's also make an important assumption that this behavior is related to survival or to fitness in some way. So we might think about what happens if, let's say, a predator moves into this population and eats all the bold individuals that do stupid stuff. Then you might imagine the bold individuals are removed from the population, they get eaten, and they're removed from the population, they die out. Then, over time, over the course of generations, we would expect a population to just consist of shy individuals because bold individuals have been removed. So from this kind of thought exercise, this is meant to illustrate that it's hard to explain why is there variation in traits that are heritable and that also are related to fitness, that influence things like survival and reproductive success. Because if they're related to fitness and their selection, then we think of natural selection as being a kind of optimizing force that removes variation from populations. But the reality is, as I was trying to explain earlier, we have more and more evidence and more appreciation that there's lots and lots of variation within populations. So what are the types of factors that can not only generate that variation, but that can maintain it within natural populations? This is a huge problem in all of evolutionary biology to try to explain the maintenance of, say, genetic variation within natural populations. And this is just applied here to behavioral types of traits. So when we think about personality, though, we're not only, we not only think that variation is important for personality, but another really important thing about personality is that individuals differ from each other, but they also have a way of behaving consistently through time. So a given individual, let's say, has a personality that they take with them as they grow, as they move into different situations, et cetera. So not only is variation important for personality, but also this idea that there is within individual consistency. That when I say that I have this particular personality, that means that if you were to meet me next week, there's some element of stability in my behavior. So there's some kind of predictability through time. So we want to be able to explain not only why do individuals differ from each other, but why do particular individuals behave consistently, either through time or across context, let's say when you put animals in different situations. And to illustrate why this is an interesting scientific question, I'm going to kind of go through a thought exercise here that's inspired by studies of salamander larvae, which are pictured up there in the top of the slide. So these salamander larvae, they occur in these streams, and the big, most important thing to do for these salamander larvae is to just eat and eat and eat, because the more they eat, the bigger they can get, and the faster they'll be able to metamorphose and get out of the dangerous streams. So, foraging activity is highly correlated with just activity, rates of movement. So in this hypothetical illustration here, each of those different lines here represents the behavior of a different salamander larva. And what you can see is that rates of activity are really high when predators are not around. And this is good, right? Because activity means more food. More food is good because that means you get big and it means you get to metamorphose, et cetera. However, note that everybody shifts behavior down, shifts activity down, though, in the presence of predators. So like I said, high levels of activity are good for foraging, but high levels of activity are actually not so good when there's predators around, because that's what predators cue in on. And so animals that are active in the presence of predators are more likely to be eaten. Now in this hypothetical example, importantly, all of our salamander larvae are decreasing activity in the absence versus presence of predators. So each of these lines here represents the behavior of a different individual. So there's behavioral plasticity. Animals are changing their behavior in response to the environment. But a really important thing about this example is notice that the rank order differences between individuals are the same in these two different situations. So the animals that are most active in the absence of predators are also the ones that are most active in the presence of predators. But like I said, the best thing to do is to be really, really active in the absence of predators. That means more food. And to be really, really inactive in the presence of predators. So the ideal animal would look like this, would have kind of their behavioral profile or their reaction arm would look like this, indicated by these stars. And notice that no single individual in this example is hitting the optimum as indicated by those two stars in both situations. So the really active individuals are doing great. They're closest to the stars in the absence of predators, but they're actually the ones that are furthest from the stars in the presence of predators. So when individuals have a behavioral type or a behavioral tendency that they take with them through time and across situations, such that, let's say, the most active individuals are consistently most active, that can represent a form of what we might think of like limited behavioral plasticity. Animals should be changing their behavior more than they actually do. Note, I'm not saying that there's no behavioral plasticity. Everybody is shifting activity down, but they're not shifting their behavior as much as they should. So that raises important questions about what are some kinds of constraints or limits on behavioral plasticity or behavioral flexibility. And this is part two of the important kind of scientific questions about personality in animals, is to try to explain what are the things that limit behavioral flexibility. The other thing I like about this example is that although we kind of think that personality might be something, that requires cognitive machinery or sophistication or something like this, but when you view it in this way, this idea that personality reflects a part of an individual's behavioral type or tendency that they can't change, then personality is not so much about cleverness. Having personality is kind of a stupid thing to do because it means that animals aren't changing their behavior as much as they ideally should. Okay, so in my lab, we have been interested in trying to understand these questions. Why do individuals differ from one another? And also, why do they have a personality or a behavioral type that they take with them through time and across situations? We've been exploring these questions in sticklebacks. So sticklebacks are these little fish. They're really cool for lots and lots of reasons. And here are just some of them. So sticklebacks are incredibly variable, and they seem to have this penchant for being able to evolve really rapidly when they're put into a new environment. So we study primarily sticklebacks that occur in freshwater, but sticklebacks are weird among fishes in that they seem to be able to live both in seawater and in freshwater. And all freshwater sticklebacks are actually derived from marine fish. So kind of the prototypical marine ancestor looks like this, and it has lots and lots of these lateral plates along the sides of its body. But repeatedly, over geologic time, these marine fish have moved into freshwater, and they seem to be able to really rapidly adapt to being in different kinds of environments. And some of the variation that we observe among freshwater populations is shown in this figure here. So this is showing some of the morphological variations. So we see things like changes in the number of these lateral plates that they have on the sides of their body, changes in body shape, number of spines, etc. So this is showing some of the morphological variation, but believe me that there's just as much, if not more, behavioral variation among freshwater populations as there is morphological variation. So sticklebacks are great for studying evolution because we can compare different populations when we think that a lot of variation is adaptive. We also see the replicated evolution of similar types of traits in similar environments. So when marine fish move into a similar kind of freshwater environments that are similar, they seem to evolve the same types of traits in response to the same environments. So we have kind of replicated evolution of similar types of traits, which allows us to ask questions about whether evolution always occurs via the same or different mechanisms. There's also a really great ethological history of studying sticklebacks, and by that I mean we know a ton about their behavior. And actually some of the founders of the study of animal behavior, including Nico Tinbergen, studied sticklebacks. So we know a ton about their behavior. And then finally, there are a growing number of genomic tools, including a full genome sequence for this species. So just to give you a flavor of some of the kinds of work that we do with sticklebacks, this is a video underwater of sticklebacks in a stream. And what you would see is there are a bunch of little fish that are just swimming together. And they're forming, oh, actually, you can see, there's one right there. They're swimming together in kind of a loose shoal. And one of the things that we have been interested in is trying to, like with those pumpkin seed sunfish, ask questions about whether personalities, whether different behavioral types of sticklebacks occur in all sorts of environments within the field, and what types of microenvironments, including different social environments, might favor different behavioral types. And this work actually is inspired in part by studies in human personality, which has documented this funky thing that probably none of you would be too surprised by, which is this idea that different personalities in humans tend to occur in different types of environments. So for example, you might be more likely to see introverts at a museum, and you might be more likely to see extroverts at parties. You could probably think of other examples like depressed people going to bars, but we know from our own experience in humans that depending on your personality, you experience different types of environments. And actually those different types of environments, if animals actually do better in different types of environments, that could be a potent mechanism that could maintain variation in personality types within natural populations. And in the human personality literature, people have been really worried about this because it poses problems when you're trying to do things like estimate the heritability of personality traits, so it can be a big problem. But that's also been really well studied to understand the mechanisms that can generate these types of non-random associations between personalities and the environment. And some of the different mechanisms include things like active mechanisms, where maybe depending on your personality, you might actively seek out different environments. You know, maybe shy people go to museums because they like to go to museums and they put themselves in museums. Versus passive mechanisms, where maybe just an animal ends up in a particular environment based on its behavioral type, not because it's choosing it, but maybe because it's excluded. And then my favorite mechanism is this idea that there are evocative processes, like maybe, depending on your personality, you influence the environment that you experience via your own behavior. So you can imagine like the chatterbox, somebody who talks a lot, a real extrovert, might influence its own social environment by influencing the behavior of other individuals that they're interacting with. So these types of mechanisms have been really well studied in human personality psychology. We're just starting to gain some appreciation of similar things happening in non-human animals as well. But what's happening in this video is this is showing one of our ways of measuring behavior in the field. So what we'll do is we'll collect animals in the field in different types of environments, and then we'll put them in what we call the stickle pod, which is this little cube here. And then there is there's a cork on the side of the stickle pod, and we remove the cork and we wait to see how long does it take the fish to emerge from being in this kind of safe shelter. And we can do this repeatedly, so we can put the animal repeatedly through this test. And individuals differ. Some individuals quickly shoot out and immediately start exploring around, whereas other individuals take a much longer time to start emerging. So these differences are repeatable, they're consistent, and we've also found that depending on an animal's behavioral type, how they behave in this assay, they tend to occur in different types of environments within the field, including in different social environments. So we think that maybe some of this variation and this shyness, boldness can be maintained by differences in social environment use. So just to give you a sense of another part of what we've been really interested in is that's important for the biology of sticklebacks is not only do we know a ton about their behavior, like their boldness behavior, but also during the breeding season, male sticklebacks are the ones who provide all of the parental care for offspring. So these are seasonal breeders. Males are territorial, so they defend these nesting territories. They build a nest. After he makes a nest, a female will come and swim through his nest and spawn, release her eggs. Then he'll swim after her, fertilize the eggs, and then she buzzes off. And he does all of the childcare. And childcare is really hard. Everybody loves to eat fish eggs because caviar is delicious. So he has to be constantly on guard against predators who are constantly trying to eat his eggs. He continues to defend his eggs after they hatch into these little larvae. These little larvae are somewhat helpless, and they're very bad swimmers, but they'll start to kind of swim away. He'll actually chase after them, pick them up in his mouth, and spit them back into his nest. And he'll continue to care for them for up to 3 weeks or so. Males lose weight during this time. They work really hard. You look at their fins after parenting, and they're all worn. They stop eating. I mean, it's really hard to be a stickleback dad, but it's absolutely essential for his fitness. His kids will die if he does not take care of them. So it's really, really important. One of the things that we've been really interested in is whether different males, whether different dads have different personalities, and if the personality of their father can influence the behavioral development of their offspring. So some of the experiments that we've done, these videos just kind of show what I described. This is showing what one of these nests looks like with a male stickleback above it. In this video, sorry that I'm not going to be able to show you, there's a little larva, and you can see the male chase after a larva and spit it back into his nest. And then in this video, this is actually in the field of a male who's defending his nest from a bunch of other fish who are trying to eat his kids. So one of the things we've been really interested in is whether fathers differ in how much care they provide. And these are some data actually just from a behavioral point of view showing how time spent fanning. So this is one of the really important things that dads do. They fan their eggs to oxygenate them. Fanning goes up until right around hatching, and then it goes down. Each of these different lines represents the behavior of a different individual male, and some guys fan more than others, even under very standardized conditions in the lab. Moreover, we can mate dads repeatedly within the lab, and we find that dads differ in their parenting behavior consistently through time. So he can mate, again, later in the season, and some dads consistently provide more care than others, even across subsequent mating attempts. So we think these are really intrinsic kind of individual differences in fathering behavior. Moreover, we do experiments where we can remove eggs from dads' nests as they're providing care, and then we can look at the impact of fathering on their offspring. So what we can do is we can compare full sibs that either have or have not received care from their father and see what's the influence of having different amounts of care. And one of these, this figure is just showing the behavior of their offspring, their reaction to a pike predator. And we see that offspring from some dads are really different depending on whether or not they got care from their dads. But other fathers, like here father 11, there's not a big difference between orphaned versus father-reared offspring, which suggests that some dads are providing more care than others, and it's really the paternal behavior that's influencing offspring development. We've been interested in the genetic and the epigenetic mechanisms by which some of this happens. So one of the things we've been interested in doing is measuring things like DNA methylation and also changes in chromatin accessibility as a function of paternal care. And that's what some of these data here are showing, is how fathers vary in parental care and how that's related to the expression of a gene that's really important for de novo methylation in their offspring's brains.